That's what you got to do. All right. So I'm going to welcome everybody. We are, what is it, Tuesday? We're deep into chapter 3, talking about the energy systems. And basically, when we look at these energy systems, what we did last time is we just introduced the 3 energy systems. And I think we got into ATP phosphocreatine and the glycolytic system, where the first 2 are anaerobic, happens in the cytoplasm. Then we've got the oxidative system, which we didn't get to, but we will in this class for sure. So when we look at these, we had a little fun last time too, talking about the strength and power sports and the endurance sports, because remember, the strength and power are these anaerobic type sports. And whether it be ATP phosphocreatine, whether it be the glycolytic system, it depends on the duration of the activity and the intensity. Remember, that's a good point. If you don't have this in your notes yet, really what determines what energy system is predominant is the intensity of the activity. Because if I ask you to run as hard as you could down the track, you would only make it about 100, 200 yards. I mean, just like all out, everything you got. You would only be able to go 10, 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds max if you're running all out. Right? If you're sprinting as hard as you could go. And then as the intensity is lowered, then it allows you to run further, right? Or go further, whether you're running, swimming, whatever you're doing. And most of these strength and power sports, the energy system is determined by how long a play lasts, right? Not how long the game lasts, but how long the play lasts. Okay. This is why when we were doing the chapter 2, talking about energy expenditure calculations, I wanted you to look at the activity factor in how long are they actually participating in the play, not necessarily, because a football game could last, let's be honest, football games sometimes drag on for hours. Just because the game lasts 2 hours, 3 hours, doesn't mean the sport is actually aerobic, right? Because they're not running and being active that whole time. There's a lot of breaks and stops and starts, and that's kind of the intermittent aspect of strength and power sports. And then if you do have an activity where you continuous, and that's what we talked about, everything from, anything over a couple minutes is going to be endurance stuff, like maybe 2 laps around a track. And we'll look at this. A mile for sure, mile run. If you're swimming, biking, those are those endurance type activities. We even talked about the gal swim from Cuba to Florida. We talked about the bike race that goes all across America. You have go across as fast as you can with little sleep. So there's some crazy events out there. The Badwater 135 where you're running. So just as a quick review, the ATP phosphocreatine system, just as you remember, is an all-out effort for very short duration. I say 15 seconds here. It could go maybe up to 30 max, but usually around that 10, 15-second mark is a good point. We think about a football play. We think about like a play in basketball where they're sprinting up and down the court, and then it's a fast break. Let's see, what else would be an example? A 100-yard sprint. In football, they do 40-yard sprints is what they do, right? So those are all examples, but it's all out effort, really short duration. But the challenge with the ATP phosphocreatine system is that we only get 1 ATP for every creatine phosphate molecule. And that's where we went with this last time, and basically said, hey, we got this creatine phosphate. Creatine we get from meat, and we'll talk more about all of the ins and outs of the supplement in the later chapter at the end of the semester. But we basically have this creatine phosphate molecule, and an enzyme will split this, and we'll take that phosphate, add it to ADP to regenerate ATP. Because remember, we only have ATP in limited amounts. We usually have 3 to 5 times the amount of creatine phosphate as we do ATP. So as long as we're able to donate it, we can maintain our energy levels to a higher level at a higher rate for a longer period of time. And that's what we're showing you here. Like this is sprinting on a bicycle, and you start out sprinting, and so time zero, and within the first 2 seconds, your creatine phosphate levels are at about 50%, but the ATP levels will be maintained until essentially you have no creatine left, and creatine phosphate. So you have no phosphate that you have available to donate to regenerate ATP. And so that's why we usually say around 10, 12, 15 seconds is all you're really going to have. And this is the reason people supplement, because if you've got higher starting levels of creatine phosphate, then you're able to donate more phosphate. You're able to go a little longer at a higher intensity, lift a extra rep or two. You're able to, do some things that will allow you to become stronger and bigger. And this is really one of the only supplements that will work. But okay, you get the idea. And we showed you last time, if you remember, last time we showed you the Wingate test, an example of that. But we could have shown you someone doing a 1-rep max bench press or 3-rep max bench press. That would have been the same, just no all-out effort, very short duration. And so when the effort is still really high, but not all out, what's going to happen is we're going to move on to the next energy system, and that's glycolysis. And we say glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose, right? This is usually we start with glycogen that's stored in our muscle, and that process is called glycogenolysis. And the process of glycolysis is an anaerobic process where, and glycolysis is important. I just had started glycolysis in my other class before this one. And, glycolysis happens in all the cells of our body, even, like the red blood cell, it only runs glycolysis. So it's a pretty important process, happens in all our cells. And when you talk about it, it's really anaerobic. But the fate of this glucose is determined by the availability of oxygen. So what tends to happen, say this is our muscle cell. We've got glycogen that will be used. Usually glycogen will be used first. It's that stored carbohydrate. And glycolysis is this process where we end up, and I don't do a good job drawing this, in that you really end up with 2 molecules of pyruvate and then potentially 2 molecules of lactate. I think I probably have this maybe on another slide, but the point of this slide really is to say you either start with glycogen that's stored in the muscle, or you start with glucose that's being brought in from the blood. And so the end product is either lactic acid or pyruvic acid. And lactic acid is our anaerobic fate. Lactic acid is and the reason for that is when intensity is really high during exercise, you need energy fast. We don't have oxygen available, or not enough oxygen available for this pyruvate. And so what happens is you go one step further and you convert pyruvate to lactate. And if you've exercised long enough, you're familiar with that burning sensation that you get in your muscle when lactate accumulates, and the hydrogen ions that are associated with this step add up and accumulate. It's really the hydrogen ions that cause your muscles to be that burning sensation. But the point is, glycolysis is a process. It's a multi-step process where you take glucose that's coming in from the blood, or you take glycogen, and both of these can happen at the same time. But the point is, you run through this 10-step process that happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. Remember that, cytoplasm of the cell. And how many, just out of curiosity, how many know this? How many carbons is glucose? You should know this. How many carbons is glucose? 6. Vince says 6. Okay, it says 6. Good. So we end up with 2, 3 carbon pyruvates. we end up with 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules. And so the availability of oxygen, I'm going to say O2 available, will determine what happens here. And for us, for this energy system, for the glycolytic energy system, what happens is you need energy quickly. And so you take this pyruvate and convert it into lactate. Okay. But the problem again with the challenge with this system is when you go through this process and you end up with lactate through glycolysis, you're only producing a small amount of energy. You're either producing 2 or 3 ATP every time you run through glycolysis for one glucose molecule or one glycogen. Glycogen being broken down to glucose. If you start with glycogen, you end up with 3 because it's already in the muscle. If you start with glucose, you end up with 2 because you actually use energy to bring it into the cell. That's the difference. When you may have studied this somewhere where you see with glycolysis you get 2 or 3. For us, the most important part is you need energy quickly because the intensity is so high, and you end up with lactate. And we gave you examples of this last time. We gave you examples of, 1 lap around a track would be a good example. We gave you the 225 bench press, NFL bench press test would be an example of that. Anything that's somewhere between, where the ATP phosphocreatine system leaves off, somewhere between 15 to 30 seconds and a couple of minutes. And again, this is near maximal effort where you're breaking down glucose via glycolysis. And again, you don't get much energy from this. That's the challenge, right? And we talked about some other examples of this, like we talked about, and I'll type this in the chat, like wrestling would be an example of this. Boxing would be an example of this. Right? Anything that's a couple of minutes, a shift in hockey could be an example of this. Everybody following this, the sports for us, the sports that are involved, 100-meter dash, just 100 meters, that's ATP phosphocreatine. But if you want to go 1 lap around a track, like this person's probably, I always think this is a athlete he's on a relay team. He's got a baton, right? He's going to do 1 lap around a track. Then he's going to hand it off to his teammate, and he's going to do a lap, right? You're going to do about 4 by 400. And I think we got to this last time, basically just talking about glycolysis, in that I don't care that that it's all the different steps, but basically you've got this 6-carbon glucose, whether you bring it in from the blood or whether you break it down from glycogen that's stored in your muscle, and you end up with 2 pyruvate molecules. If intensity is really high, like you're doing 1 lap around a track all out as fast as you can go. And again, when I say as fast as you can go, it's relative, right? You're going to have, it's not as fast as you could run like 100 meters, but your pace, there is some pacing that takes place when you're running 1 lap around a track. Or if you're swimming in the pool and you're doing, say, 100 meters, something like that. So you take this 2 pyruvate molecules, and you convert them. And I should probably put a 2 at the top of this, because that basically you've got 2 lactate molecules that end up as a result of this system. And we call this an incomplete breakdown. I think we did this last time, because pyruvic acid is 3 carbons. So is lactic acid. So you really don't break it down any further. You go from, 1 6-carbon glucose to 2 3-carbon pyruvates to 2 3-carbon lactates. Okay. But this is called, to differentiate the end product, we oftentimes will call this anaerobic glycolysis, where we go from glucose or glycogen to lactate. In your like NSCA textbooks, they just may call this the lactic acid system, the system where you take glucose and it ends up as lactate. And it's an inefficient process because you end up with 3 carbons. Now, your body's pretty smart. It's going to do something with this. It's going to take these carbons and convert them back to glucose at some point. But I mean, this is an incomplete breakdown. But the thing is, and I don't show you all the details here of this process, it's actually beneficial to create lactic acid because there's a molecule, you may have heard of it. It's called NADH, NAD. NAD is created and converted into NADH. And when you go from pyruvate to lactate, you reconvert the NADH back to NAD, and it can come back up into this earlier part of the process and continue this last little energy producing part of the process as long as it can until lactic acid builds up. So that's why, lactic acid gets a bad rap, because they think that it's bad, it's a bad guy, but really it allows you to produce as much energy as you can until eventually this lactic acid and the hydrogen ions build up that it stops your exercise. Which is what we saw when we were watching the guy with the 225 bench press test. Now, and that's what we're saying, pyruvate to lactate is anaerobic glycolysis. If exercise is a little more moderate, I mean, it can still be pretty high, and it's all relative, right? You got these like Kenyan Olympic marathoners, right? You got these Kenyan marathoners, or any marathoners for that matter, and these high-end top runners. They're running 4 minute and 4.5 minute per mile pace for 26 miles. None of us could probably do 1 mile at 4.5 minutes, but they're able to do 26 miles. For them, it's all relative in that it's still pretty high. I mean, they're probably still running 80-85% of their max. But I guess, again, because what if we couldn't run 1 mile at that? So my point is, that's still at a pace that they can continue for 26 miles. So they're probably producing a little lactic acid, but the majority of it is this pyruvate is taken on into the mitochondria. Oxygen is present, okay, when that happens. And so this is what it looks like. I think I've got the next slide just showing you. So this was the true anaerobic fate here, where you got lactic acid as the end product. Or if oxygen is available, you take these 2 pyruvate molecules into the mitochondria, and you create a little structure called acetyl-CoA. You may have heard this. This is kind of the common molecule that everything's funneled to. You'll hear this again when we talk about fat in the fat chapter, but acetyl-CoA comes in and is produced. You go from 2 3-carbon structures to 2 2-carbon structures when oxygen is available. And these 2-carbon structures then go through the Krebs cycle and produce a 1-carbon structure. What's that 1 carbon? Somebody? Anybody? Come on now. There you go. CO2. You got it. Yeah. That's exactly what happens. So my point of showing you all of this is, yes, the glycolytic system is, and remember, you're using carbohydrate, which is the only nutrient that can be broken down anaerobically. Say that again. Carbohydrate's the only nutrient that can be broken down anaerobically. We're getting ready to talk about the aerobic system, where you're going to use fat, be a big player, and protein if you need it. But carbohydrate has options of, if you need energy quickly, you can create this pyruvate and turn it into lactate. If oxygen is available, you can take this pyruvate on into the mitochondria. And even when you're doing, say, like higher level, like 1 lap around a track, like I said, you're still using a little bit of oxygen here and taking some of this pyruvate into the mitochondria, but the majority of it is being shifted still inside the cytoplasm to lactic acid, because it allows this part of the process, this steps, really, if you look at the numbers, I think it's like steps from 6 to 10 to continue as long as you can. Okay. But just know this is the when you take pyruvate into the mitochondria to acetyl-CoA through the Krebs cycle, that's the complete oxidation of glucose, just like I described, because you go from 2,3 carbons to 2,2 carbons to 2,1 carbons as you go through the Krebs cycle, and we're not going through any of that. And then the electron transport chain, which is part of this, which I'm not even showing. And that's okay, because I just want us to get the big picture. For us, sports are, you train your systems to perform, like the metabolic specificity we mentioned, right? So anything that requires you to run, like that's the reason, basketball is a strength and power sport, but there's still a little over, meaning it's mainly ATP phosphocreatine system activity. All out effort, really short duration, even though you continually move along the way. There may be times when you start to use this lactic acid system, and I always mention like doing line drills. Doing a line drill, it's probably going to take you longer than 30 seconds. If you remember what those are, right? You just start on the end line and you run to one line, touch it, and come back to the end line. Then you go to another line and come back. Again, the coach didn't know that they were training this lactic acid, this glycolytic system to perform, but that's what they're trying to do. Okay. But when you take this on in, it's aerobic glycolysis, just to differentiate from the anaerobic glycolysis, where the process ends up in lactic acid. Okay. I think I'm beating the dead horse there. All right. So then this next system is the aerobic system, the oxidative system. And this is different in that it occurs in and I guess is everyone okay with this? Just the basics of understanding that we have these first two systems that are anaerobic, ATP phosphocreatine system, and then we got this glycolytic system. When you go beyond that 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, then the glycolytic system, it starts to allow your body to break down carbohydrate, glucose for energy. If intensity is really high, does that make sense? You're going to break down glucose. It's going to end up as lactic acid. You're going to produce some energy, not as much as you could, but you need to produce energy quickly, so you end up converting that to lactate. The next system is the oxidative system, where we tend to call it more moderate, but like I mentioned earlier, depending on the athlete, I mean, you still could be running pretty darn fast or going pretty hard. Anything over a couple of minutes to hours, and I would even say days, but it's long duration activity. And aerobically, you're going to be able to produce way more ATP, depending on what textbook you look at. I know if some of you had me in class before, I say 36 to 38 ATP. Your book says 32 to 33 ATP for one glucose molecule. But here's the kicker, is you're also going to be able to use fat. And with one fat molecule, let's say it's just your run-of-the-mill 16-carbon fatty acid, you're able to produce over 100 ATP. So my point is, you're able aerobically to produce so much more energy, not just because you're able to break down this glucose all the way to CO2, but you're also able to break down fat. And it's a primary method of energy production during any of these endurance events. And so that's when we think of endurance or aerobic, whether it's biking, running, swimming for fitness. We're not talking about splashing around the pool, but so that's everybody okay with understanding that. And so this is these are the steps then. And this is just for carbohydrate, where you have glucose or glycogen, and this is me trying to draw a little bit of the what's produced here. You're producing two or three ATP along this process. You're producing some of these NADH molecules, and this is important again when we start talking about energy, because NADH, think of NADH, and then there's another one called FADH2. These are think of them as containing energy, stored energy, that eventually you're going to take that stored energy and you convert it into ATP. Another fancy word, and I probably have it on a slide somewhere coming up, for the aerobic system. Have you heard this? It's called oxidative phosphorylation. Have you heard that? Anybody heard that in the chat? Type yes, no. Oxidative phosphorylation. That's the fancy way to say, hey, we're going to use oxygen to generate ATP. And some of this ATP is produced directly through these processes, like through the process of glycolysis, through the process of the Krebs cycle, which you'll see in a second. And then a majority of them, though, are stored energy in this NAD molecule. And there's a vitamin associated with this. It's niacin, if you've studied this, in this molecule. But essentially what's going to happen is we're going to take this NADH, and it's going to be shuttled into the mitochondria from glycolysis, and then you're going to be able to produce a bunch of NADHs in the Krebs cycle, and that's how you get all this energy. But there are three parts to this. There's the aerobically, to use carbohydrate, you've got to end up with the 2,3 carbon pyruvate molecules, and then as we convert, and I just have a little dotted line, when we take this from the cytoplasm into the mitochondria, we give off a CO2. Everybody take a deep breath, blow it out. There's your CO2 coming from the carbons are coming from the foods that you eat. And this is the big picture concept I think a lot of students miss, is that the carbons that you're breathing out are coming from the foods that you eat, the carbons in the foods you eat. So you lose a CO2 and you end up with a two carbon acetyl-CoA molecule. And then it goes through the Krebs cycle, and you produce a bunch of these NADHs, and you end up in the electron transport chain, which is also in the mitochondria. So it's a whole, this is where you're putting all these metabolic processes together. This is beyond the scope of this class, other than the point of showing you this is that aerobically it's a more complicated process, and it takes more time to get geared up, right? So it takes 2 to 3 minutes before it even becomes the predominant energy system. Okay. All right. Let's see what I got. And so this is the whole thing here. And this is in your book. I don't know what page it's on, but it's not maybe drawn exactly like this. But you can see, so you're producing through glycolysis these 2,3 carbon pyruvate molecules, and you're producing some ATP directly, and you're producing these NADHs. And these NADHs from the cytoplasm will end up over here and are shuttled into the mitochondria, but you're producing a bunch of more of these NADHs and FADH2s through the Krebs cycle. And again, you can look in the book. I'm not going into all this, but these hydrogens will line up at the beginning, and you may have studied this before, where hydrogens line up at the beginning of the electron transport chain. These hydrogens have 1 proton and 1 electron. And so the electrons are split and they're pulled off, and they pass down the chain. Ultimately, the point I'm showing you all this to say, when we talk about aerobic exercise and oxygen, is oxygen available, you don't see oxygen anywhere until the final step. Like when we showed you glycolysis, there's no oxygen anywhere. When we showed you the Krebs cycle, there's no oxygen anywhere. Oxygen is the final step here. And because aerobically we have, and this is a big picture concept, I won't ask you this on a test, but you have three end products of aerobic metabolism. ATP, which is the energy, right, we need. You've got CO2, which is given off in several places, mainly the Krebs cycle here. You're giving off, you've got those 2-carbon acetyl-CoA molecules, and as they go make turns around the Krebs cycle, you're giving them off. And then this is one that we overlook. It's called metabolic water. So this is water where we take the hydrogens and pull them off the NAD and the FADs, and we take the hydrogen and combine it with oxygen to form water. And this is where the magic happens, and all the energy is produced, really, in this part of this electron transport chain. It's complicated, but point is, I'm showing you this because to show you the different pieces. With carbohydrate, if you want, you can use it aerobically, but intensity has to be lower. And so you can use, and there's a whole process here in which that happens. But what you can also do is, this is where you can also use fat and you can use protein. And this is where it comes in, right? It's 2-carbon structure. Because fat, we use, if you remember, we talked about the nutrition basics, we have these long chain fatty acids, right? And the process of breaking the fat down is called beta oxidation. Beta means 2. Well, 2 carbons is what that means. And so these 2 carbons will be funneled as acetyl-CoA. And then they just enter into the Krebs cycle. So you think about it, with a glucose molecule, which is this is a 6-carbon structure, right? You end up with 2 3-carbon pyruvates and 2 acetyl-CoAs. With a fatty acid, if it's 16 carbons, you got like 8 acetyl-CoAs. You got, if you have 8 acetyl-CoAs, that means you got 8 turns of the Krebs cycle. You're getting a lot more energy, is my point. Because not only you're able to break down carbohydrate, you're able to break down fat. And then you could even use protein if you need it, but we typically don't do that. So any of these sports where you're doing, long distance running or swimming, or, even like I said, a mile run, we'll look at some of these other percentages coming up, but that's the aerobic system. And one of the most important things to share with you here is, as you're looking at these energy systems, as you start to exercise, all 3 of these energy systems want to engage. But the problem is that really only one of them is going to be the predominant energy system. And in the chat, I want to hear this in the chat. Type it in. What determines the energy system that you're using? What's the major factor? Yes, thank you, Ella. Yes. One will predominate based on exercise intensity. So think about this. And I do a better job with this when you're face to face, and we can kind of walk through. How many of you have either participated or seen a 5K? Anybody participated in a 5K? Yeah. A couple of you have? Yeah, participated. Okay, yeah. So think about, and I always make fun of this, is that who usually gets up at the starting line in the very front of a 5K? I know some of you will say it's the fit people, right? The super fit people, but there's another group. They always want to get up at the front of your 5Ks and these races. It's the little kids. Anybody seen this? Yeah, the little kids. They want to get up at the front because they want to be, they want to, I don't know why they do that, but someone should tell them don't do it. But what happens is they'll take off and they'll sprint as fast as they can for about 50 yards. And then what happens? They just stop right in the middle of the course, and it's dangerous for people, right? But the reason that the fit people get up there is they want to get away from because at the beginning of a race, it's kind of chaotic, people running, You just want to get in your own zone and find your way and tell everybody stay out of the way, right? So you're sprinting off the line, and this is what happens. Think about this. You're using that ATP phosphocreatine system for that initial burst off the line when you're doing a 5K, let's say. And then within these first, minute or so, you're still running pretty intensely because you're trying to find your pace. You're trying to find some open space, right, in that first, half a mile or so. And so as you do that, the predominant energy system becomes glycolysis. And then at some point you find your pace for the 5K that you're going to run, and you then really, that's when the oxidative system gears up, and you're able to use, because the 5K is primarily aerobic in nature. But you use all three of these. See, if I said, okay, I want you to sprint all out for 100 meters, because the intensity is so high, you would never make it to glycolysis. You would never make it to the oxidative system. Does that make sense? And then what can happen is, and you've probably seen this before, like, okay, it's primarily a aerobic, a 5K is primarily an aerobic race event. But as you get down to the end of your race and you look behind you and you see Tommy, and Tommy beat you in his last race, and you're like, oh, this isn't happening anymore, then you can increase the intensity. And so you're probably going to start producing more lactic acid and using more glycolytic energy systems and less oxidative. So there's a trade-off. As you get towards the end and you're sprinting at the end, you might produce more lactic acid than you were and use less oxygen, but the trade-off is you're going to run faster. Okay, so that's how that works. Everybody okay with this? And just seeing that all three of these, when you start to exercise, try to engage, but one or the other is going to be the predominant energy system based on the intensity, because the intensity affects how long you'll end up going or can go, right? Everybody okay with this? Because this is an important concept to understand. And this is how this plays out. So let's do this real quick. I want to introduce your homework assignment that's due Sunday night at midnight before the exam opens, and it's your energy systems chart. So let me see if I can find this. I'm going to stop sharing real quickly, and I'm going to see if I can do another share. You should see this in chapter 3, and I've got this pulled up. Let's see if I can make it bigger. I just wanted to show you this. I can enable editing, and I can increase the size. I don't know how far I want to increase it, but let's make it. You should be able to see that. And I think this is the same one that's in your, because I changed these, the sports, but I think this one should be the correct one. But essentially what you do is I just have sports listed, and we can go over this if you want to on Thursday, give you some time to look at it. But swimming 25 meters, and anytime if I say a sprint, that's going to be all out. That's like, that's going to be the ATP phosphocreatine system. So what I wanted you to do is you look at the sport, the activity, what's the predominant energy system, what's the fuel, and even though, ATP phosphocreatine, you're not using carbs, fats, proteins, but you're using creatine, good enough, and then it's all out effort. And on the opposite end, like a marathon, this is an aerobic, or you could put oxidative if you want to. You're able to use carbohydrates and fats, and it's moderate intensity. Okay, and I give you a guide here to go through. So basically, you're just running through these different sports and activities. I just kind of randomly put these on here. Like I said, I change them sometimes, but I'm like diving, springboard. You're like, okay, I know what diving is, but what is a springboard? springboard is where you walk out on the thing and bounce one time, and then you do your flips and somersaults. But either way, it's going to be anaerobic, right? It's going to be ATP phosphocreatine because it only takes like a couple of seconds. And if you have trouble with these, you can always just look them up. Like if you don't know what a vault is in gymnastics, and just go look. Tour de France cycling, okay, that's going to be a longer biking, weightlifting. Everybody see this? Any questions on this? Let me pull up the chat because I lose it. And so your goal is to work through this because you know why? Because you're going to have some of these on a test. I never have you do anything that you don't eventually do or have a test over, or you're going to have some questions, and they're going to be pretty clear on which system is going to be the predominant. Because I know sometimes there's overlap, like when you look at things like UFC fighting, like a round of UFC. I mean, there's some overlap there. So I could go either way on that one, as far as, but it's going to be anaerobic. It's like, is it ATP phosphocreatine or is it glycolytic? So questions, comments on how to do this homework. You basically just fill it in and submit it in Blackboard. Yeah. Looked a bit for percentages of intensity for glycolytic. Couldn't find them. Intensities. Oh, yeah. So just, what did I say down here? Do I have intensity? Yeah, just all out is creatine phosphate, moderate to high is glycolytic, moderate to low aerobic. And see, even I put like moderate, I put 70 to 85%. Don't worry about the percentages. Just type in all out, moderate, high, low, whatever you want to do. Yeah. Yeah. Just put in, I'm more interested than you're thinking through this. Some of them are pretty clear on what the predominant is. Others are a little, like when I say aerobics dance class, if you were going to go do a Zumba class or something, that's aerobic. And it's going to be low to moderate, maybe moderate to low, whatever you want to say. You don't have to put a percentage in there. I put the percentage. That makes sense. Vault, that's like an all out. That only takes like less than 10 seconds. Man, I got the coughs and the sneezes today. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing this and then we'll go back. But we can come back around to maybe going over the answers. Let's just plan to go over the answers on Thursday. Okay. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay. Let me close this window here. And then now let's see. Now we're better. Now I got the window I can share. All right. So we should be up and running. You should be able to see my screen again. And I'm just trying to find, how sometimes using multiple monitors. So sometimes I have trouble finding my mouse. I'm like, where did it go? So when we're talking aerobic, and this is just in general about using our macronutrients, right? At rest, like right now at rest, you're probably, if you're eating, if you in a fed state and you're eating a mixed diet, you're probably burning about 60% of your calories from fat and maybe about 40% from carbohydrate. It could be higher, it could be lower based on the amount of, carbs and fats you're eating. But in general, the body's going to use carbohydrates and fats for energy. Usually protein, we know that protein has other jobs. And so its job is not to provide energy. So only about 5 to 10%, like in a fed state, like you've eaten, 5 to 10% of your calories are coming from protein, not much. And during moderate to higher intensity activity, that's when carbohydrates will be burned. And you could even see this in those lab reports. If I were to go back, or you were to go back in the lab reports that I showed you. So as intensity increases, carbohydrate use increases. In other words, that glycolytic energy system is going to be be used. If that makes sense. And like Earl, like this, I know this guy. Earl's on the elliptical, and he's just trying to get his exercise in. This is aerobic exercise, right? You're burning carbohydrates and fats, low to moderate intensity. Going to do it for 30 to 40 minutes and burn some calories, right? But if we were to increase the resistance or increase the pace, then the higher the pace, the more resistance, the more carbohydrates going to be used, and the more glycolytic energy will be needed. Okay, he'll be more anaerobic, if that makes sense. He'll have to use those anaerobic energy sources. The thing is, with most of us, like Jane Fitness here, we do a little of both. Like sometimes we'll go to the gym a couple days a week. We'll go get on the elliptical a couple days a week. And that's good because that helps with our general fitness. But for athletes, like high-end athletes, it doesn't work that way. You need to be either on this end of the spectrum or on this end of the spectrum. It's not going to, based on specificity, right? If you want to lift heavier weights, going out and running is not going to help you. But this is why a lot of us aren't like top tier athletes. One of us genetics, but the other is we're doing a little of both, right? We're doing a little of both. And it's hard to be great at something when you're doing it. I mean, you can be super fit, don't get me wrong, but you won't be the best runner if you're going to the gym trying to lift heavy all the time. So an example is volleyball. Volleyball is a strength and power sport. They're going to be more on this end of the spectrum, more strength and power. These volleyball players shouldn't be going out and running 3 to 5 miles. They should be doing strength. I've got a picture of female volleyball players. Even female volleyball players should be lifting weights. They should be doing plyometrics. Do y'all know what plyometrics are? Anybody? Plyometrics. Tell my coach that. Yeah, plyometrics. Jumping, bounding, right? They've got these volleyball devices where you can jump and do all the different things, or box jumping is an example of plyometrics. Bottom line is you just need to be, it's a strength and power sport. It takes energy to explode up, to block I don't even know what to call them, a volleyball when somebody's trying to spike it. I'm making this up. I don't play volleyball, but you get the idea. To block and to set and to do all these things, it's short bursts of energy. But you got your other sports like soccer. Soccer is more on, I wouldn't necessarily, you're not continuously running, but you are moving in soccer, especially depending on, it's a block. Yeah, sorry. Is soccer, and maybe it's the same way with volleyball. You can tell me that some positions do more movement than others. Like if I'm a goalkeeper in soccer, okay, I'm just going to stand there, wait till the ball comes down on my end, right? So it's maybe more explosive versus if you're, I'm going to get this wrong probably, midfielder. If you're a midfielder in soccer, I think that's the one where you do more movement. And it would be definitely more aerobic. Everybody following this? So it can be position specific too. But in general, you have your strength and power sports and you have your more aerobic sports. Soccer's a little in between because it is quite a bit aerobic because you're doing 45 minutes a period or a half. But anyway, you get the idea here that you have to look at the metabolic needs, which is what you will do when you do your final project. You pick your athlete, it could be yourself, but you do a needs analysis. Okay, what energy system is involved? Okay. What's the primary energy system? And this is where I was going earlier, and I said, talking about the contributions. If you're a marathoner and you're running a marathon, it's 97% aerobic and 3% anaerobic. So that means you're producing a little lactic acid. It's just not enough to stop your exercise. And then as you go from a marathon to a 10K, which is like what, 6.2? Is that right? 6.2 miles. It's still 90% aerobic and 10% anaerobic. And then as you get to a mile run, it's 80 aerobic and 20. And then you get, here's where you get the flip, the crossover. 2 laps around a track is still more aerobic than anaerobic. But then if you're just doing 1 lap, then it flips the other way. And it's about 60% anaerobic and 40% aerobic. Right. And then you get down to 100 meters and it's like 90-10, kind of like what the 10K was, the opposite end. Right. So it's almost all anaerobic and just a little bit. So in other words, some of that acetyl-CoA is still making it in the mitochondria because there's still a little oxygen there, but it's not much. Okay. The majority of it is anaerobic, and you're using that ATP phosphocreatine system. And then 3 seconds all out, pretty much all anaerobic. Everybody okay with this? And just seeing how the contributions, and when we're saying anaerobic, that means it's either the ATP phosphocreatine system or the glycolytic system, right? When you're doing this. All right. And then the aerobic system, you're using carbohydrates and fats primarily. Okay. Okay. And so let's start, and how much time we got? We got about 15, 20 minutes. We've got time to jump into this. So the last part of this chapter, so we've talked about the 3 energy systems, and we talked about the sports and activities that relate to these energy systems. But now let's talk about the muscle fiber types. And this is where I would usually draw on the board because it's usually easier to see on the board. But in general, you probably studied this before, and I've got it on the slide. But we have 2 different types of fibers, right? We've got type 1 and type 2 fibers. What else do we call those fibers? Somebody, let's see if you studied this before. Some of my people who've had exercise phys or A&P, what do they also call the type 1 and type 2 fibers? Mm-hmm. Got it. Yeah, you guys are getting it. So slow and fast twitch fibers. So if you look, the type 1 equals slow twitch. Type 2 equals fast twitch. Does that make sense? And within these fast twitch fibers, you actually have 2 varieties, a type 2A and a type 2X. It used to be B, but now they're calling it X. They're changing all these letters around. But here's what we know is that the proportion of type 1 and type 2 fibers are usually similar in an individual's arms and legs. In other words, and what does that mean? Somebody, when we talk about fiber types, what's the biggest contributor to fiber types? What determines the fiber types? Somebody, what determines your fiber types? Anybody? Nobody want to take a? Yes, thank you, Tucker. Thanks for playing along. It's genetics, right? So if you were not a great athlete in high school, you can blame your parents. Or if you were one of the athletes like me that would have to work twice as hard, and you got some other cat that's, more talented and gifted than you are, that just wouldn't have to practice really hard or show up half the time, but just would go out and perform like a champion, make you mad. Like, how do they do that? That's just a lot of it is genetics, and so just know that. And I've got some stories I can tell you, but just know that a portion of type 1 and type 2 fiber is the same. And how do we determine fiber type? We can actually do this, and this is a picture that I'm showing you here. This is an athlete. Anybody know what that's called? What are they doing? He's got pair of scissors and got a needle as part of this process. Anybody want to type in, let me know what is this called, somebody? I'll give you a second or two. Yeah, biopsy, a muscle biopsy in particular. And so this is more my sports science people. What muscle is being biopsied in this picture? This is an endurance athlete. Okay, it's a quad, but what? Come on now. For my sports people, what from exercise science, you got to tell me what muscle specifically. There are four muscles of the quadriceps. Which one is it? Come on now. I'm gonna challenge you. Oh, come on. You can tell me from that picture. What muscle? Don't make my wife come over here and look and tell me what muscles being biopsied. Nobody's.
Lateralis?
Yes, vastus lateralis. Yes, thank you, Tucker. Yeah, don't make me go tell Dr. Gallagher and Dr. Bringer, especially Dr. Bringer, right? He teaches the anatomy, kinesiology class, anatomical kines. So who's teaching that now? Anyway, don't make me tell them that my exercise sports science students can't tell me what muscle is being. Come on now. Yeah, it's vastus lateralis. But what they do is a couple different ways they can pull these muscle fibers out and then they can analyze them to tell you, and there are other ways, like in the labs we've done, you can do some other things, but this is the key way. And that's what they're doing here with this athlete, because this is what it looks like. And I probably should back up, and I will back up. Let me do that. And that when we look at the type 1 fibers, and let me just back up. Well, I might have it coming up on the next slide. So this is what it looks like. You take a sample and you stain it. And what we know is that the type 1 fibers are slow twitch. And so they stain dark. The type 2 fibers are fast twitch. So they stain light. Let me give you a practical example. And we'll finish with this, and we'll come back and we'll finish the chapter and then look at your homework next time. Anybody ever seen chickens in a barnyard? Just type a yes or a no. Have you ever seen chickens in the barnyard? Yeah, you've seen them? Okay, so what do they do all day? What do chickens do all day? They kind of walk around, right? Peck the ground a little bit. And this is, the effects would be way better if I was in class with y'all. But hey, peck the ground, walk around, right? How many of you like to eat chicken? How many of you guys had chicken last night or yesterday? You had some chicken yesterday? When you look at, yeah, definitely chicken. That's common, right? Common protein. It's probably the least expensive protein beside an egg. But when you look at that chicken, can a chicken fly? This is a good question. Have you ever seen a chicken fly? You ever chased a chicken in the barnyard? Briefly. Can it get off the ground? A little bit, just a little, right? So when you eat, okay, think about this. When you eat the chicken leg, they flutter away. When you eat the chicken leg, what color is the meat? Dark. Does that make sense? Why is it dark? Because it's slow twitch. And these slow twitch fibers, they have more blood vessels, they have more oxygen that gets to them. They're more aerobic, like the barnyard chicken walking around. What color, for those of you who eat the breast and the wing, what color is that meat? Yeah, white meat. That's exactly right. So this is the difference. So because this is anaerobic fiber. The breast and the wing are anaerobic fibers. Does that make sense now? You're like, I don't want to be grossing you out talking about eating chickens and all the things, but that's the reality. Now, if you were to look at a different animal, let's say any, and I don't know, sometimes I do, most of the time I don't, and I'm not a hunter. Any of y'all duck hunters? Anyone in here go duck hunting? Maybe you got parents that are duck hunters, or I don't know. Yeah, duck hunter. Okay, so Tucker says yes. When you eat a duck breast, what color is the meat? Johanna says she's been before. Good for you. Yes, the breast on a duck is dark. Why? Because it's a migratory bird and it flies. So it's slow twitch muscle fibers. Does that make sense? And how these fibers are related to what the different animals can do. Now, and it's genetic, right? It's genetic. And just as our fiber types are genetic, some of us have more fast twitch, and you could probably tell just yourself, are you more fast twitch fiber person? Like you're better at sprinting, you're better at weightlifting, or are you a more endurance athlete and you're lean and thinner and more slow twitch? Like you could just go out and run all day. There's a good chance you could probably pick one of these. And some of us are kind of in the middle, right? Not really good at either one. I would probably be a better bodybuilder than I am an Ironman competitor. I've never won an Ironman, never planning on going to win it. I just compete for fun to stay healthy. But I would probably be a better bodybuilder than and we can talk about this in the body composition chapter 2, because this kind of relates to body composition and your body type. But going back, we have these two different types, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is the slow twitch fiber. It's aerobic, and we're gonna get into specifics. That's probably where this is going in the next slide or two, but we'll hold off and we'll come back to this fiber type stuff, finish this up next time. So we've finished up looking at the 3 energy systems. We said we got 2 that are anaerobic, we got 1 that's aerobic. We said carbohydrates, the only nutrient that can be broken down anaerobically through glycolysis, but the fate of that could be aerobic if the end product is pyruvate and we have oxygen available. We can continue to break that down along with using fat and protein if we need it, but in most cases we don't. And then anything over, and remember there are times related to this. So anything less than 30 seconds is going to be ATP phosphocreatine, 30 seconds to a couple of minutes where intensity is really high, still really high for those couple of minutes, that's going to be glycolytic. And then anything that's over a couple of minutes to hours is going to be aerobic. And then that relates to these fibers in that slow twitch fibers are going to be more aerobic. And people that have primarily slow twitch fibers are going to be good at these endurance events. People that have more fast twitch will be better at the weightlifting and the sprinting and the things. So let me do this. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll come back next time and we'll just cover the last little bit of this and we'll review this fiber type stuff next time. And we'll maybe go over your homework and we'll be ready for our first test. Get ready. And because the tests that we have are no joke of all the stuff, right? The tests always what will trip students up. So I want you to be ready, be prepared. And if you have questions, let me know. All right. We good? All right. We'll see y'all next time. I'll put this in the live call section of Blackboard. All right. Bye. Have a great day.